Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery seminar series, Legacies of Enslavement, Transatlantic Dialogues on History and Justice. My name is Liam Markey, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. It's titled Museums and the Legacies of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Just as a brief introduction to the series itself, it's an important critical intervention in the field, and it complements previous events hosted by CSIS, including lectures, panels, policy launches, film screenings, and art exhibitions, among others, all designed to educate and engage both academic and non-academic audiences. With a primary focus on the legacies of slavery in the US, Legacies of Enslavement will explore the cultural and social impacts of the slave trade on all societies involved, while fostering interdisciplinary collaboration between scholars internationally. Some of the themes that the series has covered and will cover in future include the growth of mass imprisonment and policies in the criminal justice system that disproportionately affect African American communities, the legacies of institutions, including universities, benefiting directly from enslaved labor and wealth generated from commodities produced through enslavement, the memorialization and presentation of these difficult histories in online and physical repositories. These topics are covered in the series through an in-conversation format, facilitating collaboration between scholars and professionals based at universities in both the UK and the US, and the development of their valuable research in this area. So before we begin formally with today's proceedings, I'll just briefly introduce each of our panelists. Firstly, Professor Angela Sutton is a historian of the Atlantic world and Assistant Dean for Graduate Education and Academic Affairs at Vanderbilt University. Her research concerns the tools and methods that preserve and widen access to the sources that help refine and redefine popular understandings of American slavery and its modern consequences. Professor Sophie Fuggle is James Barrow Chair of French and Head of the Department of Languages, Cultures and Film at the University of Liverpool. Her research looks at convict transportation in the French Empire and its cultural and environmental legacies. She is particularly interested in narratives of food insecurity, carceral continuities, and the role of the Prison Museum in fostering empathy and abolitionist perspectives. She's currently completing a book on French Guiana entitled Banned Books and Counterfeit Notes, Reading and Writing Against the Penal Colony, and is co-editing a collection of essays entitled Exhibiting Migration, focused on museum narratives around migration. Will Stanier is Grant Project Coordinator at University of Georgia Libraries, whose work focuses on archival research. His current project with UGA's Hargreaves Library is Finding Their Names, Description and Discovery of Enslavement Events in Archival Collections, a project funded by the National Historical Publications and Records Commission grant that has seen hundreds of historical records digitized, transcribed, and placed online, which help identify enslaved individuals and place their histories within reach of their descendants. And Dr. Mary Booth is Centre Manager at CSIS and specialises in American and British studies, museum studies, and heritage tourism studies. Her most recent contribution to the field includes a working manuscript focused on tracing the evolution of museological sites, specifically identifying different catalysts for interpretive change and evaluating the longevity and reception of representational developments. Additionally, she has published on topics including race and gender, as well as academic pedagogy, and continues to contribute to the ongoing research surrounding university benefactors and their financial links to historical racial slavery in both Manchester and Liverpool. I hope I got all of that right. Any issues, please let me know. But we'll begin with our questions. I know I've done a brief introduction there, but if you'd be able to, one at a time, we'll go around the panel. If you could give us an introduction to your own research and how it speaks to the theme of the seminar, which is museums and the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. So yeah, I don't know if we want to go in the same order I did that delivery in, or if anyone has kind of a burning desire to go first. Otherwise, Angela, if you wanted to start us off.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Can everyone hear me well? All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Great. I work with a site here in Nashville, Tennessee. It's called Fort Negley. It's on the UNESCO Routes of Enslaved Persons. And this site was from the Civil War era. It was built by enslaved and free Black people many who were escaping plantations and other places of enslavement to hide behind the U.S. Army lines in a state that was formerly Confederate, but that had been taken by the U.S. military so that we could stage the strategic Western theater, right? And so with the site, we have almost 5,000 people that we know of that have been recorded. My research has involved finding the names of everybody and putting them into a database, making them searchable. It's called the Builders and Defenders database. And with this site, all of the people who had been building were later on, those who were well anyway, were forced into the military to fight on the side of the US in the Civil War against the Confederate soldiers, right? And there's a lot of complexity with this site because some of that was voluntary, some of it was coerced and conscripted. And there, as we know in the Civil War, there's a lot of struggle over the wider message and the interpretation, but Nashville was the site that had the largest amount of Black soldiers fighting for it out of any other battle in the Civil War. And that particularly makes Nashville this really interesting place to look at the genesis of freedom and how Black soldiers envisioned themselves in the larger struggle for emancipation and then later for citizenship and equality. So there are so many wonderful ways to kind of talk about this site and touch on it. And in addition to being this just powerful heritage site of all this complexity surrounding freedom and Black people's place in the United States. It's also a park used for recreation, and that's really common in the United States. Many sites of slavery have been turned into parks where people can play, walk their dogs, have lunch. And so there's that tension always that people who are working with the park are working with to make sure that the park can serve the city as it was planned to, but that also the history is front and center in a place where these stories are still contested.
Great, thanks very much. I imagine there's going to be a lot of crossover here, then some interesting discussion from the different panelists. Yeah. Sophie, if you don't mind giving us an introduction.
Yep,
Thanks.
thanks, Liam, and hi everyone. Um, okay, so I guess my research focuses or the starting point was really looking at convict transportation and I guess its heritage in French Guiana. What's interesting about the French Empire is that following the abolition of transatlantic slave trade in 1848, about 4 years later, this was when the first, I guess, ship of convicts went over to French Guiana. So it's very much seen as kind of one regime of forced labor ends, and how can we replace it? What's interesting in French Guiana as well is that I guess in distinction to elsewhere, um, the attempt to colonize French Guiana via and develop French Guiana's agriculture via enslaved labor and then convict labor were both kind of complete failures. Um, and what you see is a space that is still it's still a little bit like a colony the way it functions. It's an overseas department of France. If you're born in French Guiana, you are French, but it very much functions in a similar way. And there's always these kind of new, big development projects. There's big kind of ecological questions around the space. What's interesting with in terms of I guess the museums you find across French Guiana is that you have the cited heritage of the penal colony. So you have the Salvation Islands, including Devil's Island. You have the transportation camp in Saint Laurent. So these are all sites that people that are very much connected to the kind of penal heritage. But then you also have other spaces which are much. So you have heritage sites linked to former plantations, which are presented differently, and there's this kind of complex connections, but also people often confuse these spaces as well. And then you have museums which very much in the context of thinking about decolonizing museums and what that means in this context, you have museums that are still like cabinet of curiosities with mix of kind of random things, shackles that were used at different points and people don't really know. And then you have taxidermy and all these things. So in terms of, I suppose, things that are happening elsewhere around decoloniality, French Guiana is a space which really raises the question of is it possible to decolonize the museum?
Great, thanks very much, Sophie. Will?
Yeah. Hey everyone. As Liam said, working at the University of Georgia Special Collections Hargrett Library. I came into grant project through the National Archives. My job is to go through the collections held at the University of Georgia, look for documents that hopefully name enslaved people but any contextualizing information to help researchers bring the personal experiences of enslaved people in Georgia and in the South and elsewhere out of the archives and put them right at the top of the bibliographic record. And our project has different phases, beginning with digitization of all those materials, bibliographic descriptions, using controlled vocabulary standards, mostly from enslaved.org, which is a data repository we're also working with closely now toward the end of the project. But yeah, digitization, bibliographic description. We're creating full text transcripts for all the handwritten material of the documents. And then, as I mentioned, final part of the project is we are taking our database and pivoting the material, enriching the metadata to form a more interactive data set that we're transferring to enslaved.org at the end of the project. Yeah, and yeah, more to say about it, obviously, but I'll leave it at that for an introduction.
Great, thanks, Will. And Mary, you don't mind?
No problem. It's great to be here with everybody. Thanks so much for kind of joining us for this conversation. And I find the title Museums and the Legacies of Transatlantic Slave Trade really fascinating because it can go in so many different directions, and you three have presented extremely diverse but overlapping ways, and I'm going to hopefully add to that as well. So I kind of come to the topic of museums and the kind of legacies of the slave trade in a couple of different ways. The first coming from my work working with the Center for the Study of International Slavery. That center is a partnership organization between the University of Liverpool and National Museums Liverpool, specifically the International Slavery, celebrating 20 years of research excellence this year. So CSIS itself has kind of been an active member in shaping this history and this rhetoric for 2 decades. And that is just kind of the edge of the cusp, as we say, for research like this. So I'm able to work with the International Slavery Museum, which originally opened as its current entity in 2007, but its original iteration was in 1994 with the Against Human Dignity exhibition in the basement of the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool. So within this kind of cusp of even looking at the museum in the most narrow focus of this one entity that's kind of gone through multiple life cycles in 94, in 2007, and then is now currently being redeveloped, we can see the kind of legacy of the conversation surrounding this topic, kind of presented in this entity that is Liverpool. And that's where my second kind of focus comes in, is I also enjoy my research looking at museums in the wider sense. So ISM is a very traditional kind of structured museum with a narrative and artifacts that we would think many museums would follow that template. And a lot of what I get to do in my research is look at entities that kind of are a bit outside of that realm of what a museum is. So heritage sites, institutional memory, archives, those that have a kind of representation of history and still embed the legacies of this trade, but do so in a slightly different or even parallel manner, but aren't often thought of when you think of museums per se. And I even am looking at Liverpool itself as a kind of representation or entity or museum of slavery. So in the most narrow form being the city, but even the wider UK and aspects of the US, you can go to cities and see the kind of legacies of this trade still evident in the DNA surrounding both countries. If we're even just looking at just those countries, even Sophie brought in kind of even further scopes of this. So kind of looking at what is a museum and how can we articulate it in the most individual scope with narrow studies, but also understand it as a broader entity of study and of colonial influence that needs to be decolonized, as Sophie was saying. So I'm excited to have a conversation with everybody today.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Yeah, I agree. It sounds like there's a lot of kind of diverse perspectives here and research experience. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone, for your introductions. I'll move on to the kind of the first proper question then. So this concerns evolving perspectives. So with regards to museums and the handling of this topic of slavery, can you speak to their potential evolution from sort of contemporary responses through to the modern day? And in turn, in your own areas of research, how have societal changes influenced the form and nature of these responses? Quite a big one. If there's anyone who kind of wants to go first, um, please feel free to just yeah, step in. We can take it from there. Or if we want to kind of do it in a specific order, or yeah, whichever.
I can go.
Yeah.
So I think with this question, it really there's so much country and regional specificity to it, right? And I think that's very evident for those of us who've kind of traveled back and forth and have done some comparative work around slavery and its legacies. So I can speak best to the U.S. Because that's sort of the thing that I'm mired in, living in the U.S. South here, along with Will. And I think here in the South, so especially in Nashville, Tennessee, we have so many sites that have to do with slavery, and those that are sort of historical sites or houses or museums, even. The vast majority of them have some plantation legacy, right? And they have money that comes from that. And that money has been used to sort of turn that site into a tourist attraction. And, you know, in the US, we are still fighting, or rather, we keep fighting the same fight over and over again about the Civil War in terms of like, what was the Civil War, right? Like, a was it essentially a huge slave revolt that started our civil rights movement, which is, I think, how a lot of progressive historians of slavery would look at it, or was it something else? Or was it multiple things? It was many things, right? And here in Nashville, a lot of our sites seem to be wanting to make at least small overtures toward having encompassing a fuller story, but that is a lot harder for some sites than for others because of financial viability. Everything in America comes down to money, and the biggest tourist dollar is still the dollar that wants to see the plantation hoop skirt narrative, right? People still want to come and they want to see the Gone with the Wind that they watch, that they so fondly held, right? And even though there are bigger tourism sectors that are now sort of developing, right? We have a wonderful civil rights trail that's national. Tennessee has a big share of that. Nashville is a really big civil rights city. We developed several of the most kind of foundational parts of the civil rights movement here. But all of the sites that had to do with slavery, especially resistance to slavery, are not on that trail. Because there is a strict division, right? The tourism board seems to behave as if they believe that older conservative white people only want to see Civil War sites and they want to hear the older narrative of the Civil War being this like glorious battle for Southern honor. And then they think that more younger, modern, diverse tourists of color of many different backgrounds are more interested in seeing how the United States coalesced around a civil rights movement that benefited us all, right? And so there's like this divide that maybe feels a little bit unnecessary coming from a site like mine, which really works with both. So thinking through like how people are trying to position themselves in a tourist economy versus how historians see the sites, you get a lot of really interesting sort of contradictions that pop out. And it's tough. There are a lot of people on that are descendants of these sites who desperately want to see even small amounts of changes because for them that is a justice that they need, that reparative justice they need for their families. But at the same time, many of those sites cannot ever be what they ought to be if we were to be truly honest with ourselves about what they were, right? A lot of these sites aren't able to make money if they were not wedding destinations, if they were not wine cellars, if they were not party venues. And so we just keep returning back to these questions of money and these questions of like who's paying the money and why, and who do we think is paying the money? And I would say that there's also even a disconnect between that because the people that we think want to see the hoop skirts, a lot of them have shown to be very interested in the fuller story.
If I could come in here on Angela's point, because I think it's a really interesting point that she brings up about kind of what the attitudes of the kind of those individuals that want to go see it and how maybe tourism boards prescribe that into the heritage. And I think one interesting concept of kind of evolution is people often associate evolution with progression or going in a singular, perhaps forward, perhaps backward, depending on what you're talking about. But it's often perceived as being quite linear, and it's not, especially when it comes museological. And you see it less in maybe more static museums like those that have multiple permanent exhibitions. Those do seem to kind of progress quite slowly. But in the heritage sites or the trails that Angela is talking about, or the stuff we've seen kind of in research coming out of Liverpool and the wider UK, progression or evolution is not necessarily forward moving. It's not necessarily consistent, and it's not necessarily building upon each other all the time. We've seen impacts of these politically, socially, culturally, and you can have multiple steps this way and then a couple steps back this way. So it's a very much a fluid conversation that I think it's important to see that, especially when we talk about like evolving representation. It doesn't always mean that we're getting closer and closer to unpicking the convoluted threads of history and getting to what historic truth and what that means is very much kind of we're going in concentric circles sometimes, and sometimes we're going backwards, and sometimes we're going forward. So I think thinking about evolution in less of a linear manner would really serve a lot of individuals that are having conversations around this. And what does evolution look like, especially what 6 years after Black Lives Matter? What do conversations look like then? But so much has happened in those 6 years. And how has conversations been moved perhaps forward to be more progressive, but then backward to be more conservative? And I think that push and pull is really, you can see it really play out, especially in those heritage sites and historic um, areas that have more change that can happen quite quickly. Whereas kind of more static museums, let's say the British Museum or even National Museums Liverpool, they take a bit more time to change permanent exhibitions so that you can see a bigger snapshot, but that would even be more of a snapshot of what was happening at that exact time and not necessarily the continued back and forth that happened in the decades surrounding the evolution of that museum.
I was going to say, Angela, also, I appreciate talking about kind of museums trying to preempt expectations of what their visitors want to see. I see that a lot in my research. I mean, all of my research is um, first and foremost focused on finding the documents and finding the names of people and bringing their histories. But, I try to do that work knowing that a lot of the users coming to our public library are in the descendant community and are looking for genealogies of enslaved ancestors. But and I talked to different researchers. I've seen a lot of interesting work being done at presidential houses and presidential mansions, and a lot of differences there as well. Because I think along with increased interest in genealogy and increased ability of just access to those documents as like technology around those records changes, that people, researchers, historians are putting this more realistic view on US presidents and their direct relationship to enslaving people in their presidential estates that are now a part of the kind of museum system of the United States. All these presidential houses are function as museums, but the kind of archaeological work that you can do at a presidential house, and reforming the focus, bringing the enslaved people of those estates into the experience of visiting the estate. Good examples, bad examples. You know, James Monroe House is doing an extraordinary kind of suite of updated archaeological research and research in the archives to find enslaved people of James Monroe and craftsmanship that was going on the estate. At the University of Georgia, interestingly, the Wormslow plantation in Savannah is actually a part of the University of Georgia libraries. And that was the original site of the Duran Library, a private library of the Duran family, an enslaving family in Savannah. And so now I see that same thing happening at Wormslow Plantation as well, where they're kind of moving their engagement from a visiting site for people affiliated with the university in a kind of benign way to a more active, let's find out where enslaved people lived on this premises, what were the quote unquote slave houses or slave quarters, and let's bring those into the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess kind of echo what Mary said about the fact that this is happening. It might happen here, but not so much there. Um, and I think that what's interesting is in the UK context, you have museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has done some great kind of artist residences, which is also about Cabinet of Curiosities, um, kind of performance art. You have Natural History Museum has done quite a lot around kind of environmental legacies, but linked up with obviously the legacy of transatlantic slave trade and obviously indigenous knowledge and the knowledge of enslaved peoples. And so on. But it often happens around the edges. So it happens it happens on the website. So if I'm looking for stuff for a class with students, I can find some great materials. But you think, well, actually, if you were visiting the Natural History Museum, this isn't front and center. You'd have to really look for it. I also think in the UK, the Museums Association, had a big campaign. I think started perhaps 5 years ago or so around decolonizing the museum. What I've noticed is that you know what happened was people sort of then were like, look, we've decolonized the museum. And I think what we're starting, and I'm talking about this with I have a PhD student who's working with Natural Justice Museum in Nottingham around rethinking their convict transportation exhibition, but also in the wider context of course, the kind of wider colonial legacies of incarceration. And what we've sort of been talking through is the fact that you don't want to be saying I'm decolonizing this thing. It's more, how can we bring in kind of decolonial practices? How can we and also think about this as the work is never going to be done. It's ongoing, and of course it has to adapt to what's happening kind of politically, what's happening in the world. It has to, I guess, pick the battles. We have to pick the battles with um, how you might work and change people's minds, and how I think maybe as Angela said, actually people do want to go deeper. They might not realize. And I think in the US, I guess the Michael Twitty's work is really great for that, and particularly when he went to Colonial Williamsburg. I find that really inspiring what he did. I know not everyone could do that, but actually really really confronting people with a different story. So yeah.
The difference between what you see on museum websites and what you see when you go there in person, that's a fascinating point.
Or even temporary exhibitions. I think one in the UK here, we love a good commemoration. We will commemorate a time in history. 2007 was a very big one for us. So the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade, there was commemoration activity all over the country. It was huge, it was massive, but it was transient. It wasn't permanent. And so a lot of that conversation has fallen off. So when we talk about evolution, a lot of scholars will go to 2007, which was really important in conversations. But where are the footprints of that? Where are the frameworks? Where are the scaffoldings? Where are the continued practices that, like Sophie was saying, was changing the way we practice? And unfortunately, like she said, there was a lot of tick box exercises, and like, oh, we've done that, we've decolonized, or we've worked with outside the communities, or we've done this, yay us, let's keep going. But it's an active process, and it isn't interesting to look at evolution in that way, but kind of understanding that though these are important interventions and really critical to the research, the way that they're incorporated is equally as important for the longevity of the research, of the complexities of museums, of understanding their impact on society.
I was also going to just mention briefly, continuing with the idea of evolution. I mean, in the research that I do, finding documents, transcribing documents, getting them for people to see. I mean, just in the last 2 years that I've started this project, the possibilities of how you can interact with these documents, how researchers can interact with them, myself as a librarian, how I can interact with documents, the technology that I can use to digitize, um, to transcribe, and then how that will affect how users interact with materials. And then I guess a little downstream from that, how museums are able to present that material. So I think a lot about two things. First, like our collections as data for researchers. So when I'm going through my documents, it's now I'm thinking less of a show and tell of the documents that we have found and more of like now I know that a researcher will be able to come into my database and look at um, the kind of like raw foundation of my materials and do like a comprehensive search, crunch the numbers, maybe use an AI software to do that. And then suddenly they have every county of the 157 counties in Georgia um, with real numbers of local imports and exports of enslaved people, county by county, building data maps and that kind of thing. I mean, I've just, um, again, a large part of our project is transcription. In the past 2 years, the AI models that can now function as transcribing machines are so much more accurate. So now we can take a whole financial account book that before would be really arduous to transcribe, hard to digitize. Um, and now an AI program can whip through that, and you can actually have a spreadsheet of following the money through enslavers, who their financial backers are in England, when they went bankrupt, how they got out of that bankruptcy, what enslaved persons were used as collateral mortgage. Those questions are much more apparent now than they used to be. And I think that will definitely become a part of the evolution of how museums and heritage institutions kind of work with this history.
Can I ask a question about that? I was thinking one of the challenges, I suppose, with museums is I guess the limited kind of material history that there is, the limited sort of objects, and obviously the need to, and obviously historically you might have a cabinet where you've got a ledger and people can look in it, and it's obviously that there's this idea that actually there's lots of ways you can visualize data and, like you say, follow the money, that I think are super fascinating. But I suppose the question is also how do you bring that into the museum again? Because a website maybe, without kind of over reliance on screens, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I mean, for my part, my answer to that begins and ends where I'm, as the archival researcher in the library, um, and never having worked in a museum, I just, it's an interesting idea. I don't know the answer for it. I feel like I could propose two or three really interesting ideas, but I have a feeling that a librarian's concept of how to get things front and center of in a museum probably has a lot more administrative complexity that I'm not realizing when I put things um, on view or exhibit for users, I just bring it up from the vault underneath the building and put it in front of them, and that, of course, is different in museums.
Okay, that's yeah, fascinating stuff, really. It kind of brings us nicely onto the second question. So this idea of kind of, yeah, what are the external pressures bringing that sort of influence and shape how museums and collections in general are kind of curated. So this next question is about visibility. So it's does your research speak to or operate outside of the more well-known or mainstream narratives of transatlantic slavery? And if so, how do these kind of narratives potentially challenge the mainstream? But yeah, it's interesting thinking about that in terms of what we just what the panelists have just discussed. Um, to what degree are you able to challenge the kind of the mainstream without kind of rocking the boat too much? I know myself working in kind of the public facing areas of museums, we were kind of told a lot of, we need to keep, a lot of it is to get donations from the visitors and things. And a lot of people who do visit are easily kind of, when narratives are that are kind of deeply ingrained in the culture are challenged by museums, it kind of does upset certain types of people. And yeah, just wondering if how do you go about that kind of tightrope walk, really?
Well, if we I would say I maybe blunder. I bulldoze the tightrope a little bit. But it's because I've been so privileged to be able to do so in my work here. And what I mean by that is that, baby, no. So sorry, I told you all. Huh. All right. So, what I mean by that is that with the site Fort Negley, there is such a robust descendant community around it that has been advocating for this site since, I mean, forever. They've never stopped advocating for it because they've always known that they've belonged to this site, right? Many of them. Some people come to that discovery later. And because there were so many people involved, right? Because we almost had 5,000 enslaved and free Black people building Nashville's defenses in the Civil War. And then because 13,000 Black soldiers defended the city, that's over 19,000 Black people who are working in some capacity to help the US win the Civil War, right? And then to help further that discussion of what now? What do we do with formerly enslaved people? How can they integrate into our country? And so, because of that sheer number, it's been really nice to have such a large community of people who really want to talk about this, who have strong ideas about it. And also a lot of people who are in some way related to the site, even though they are not direct descendants, right? Like there's a big community that's sort of really robust. And the city made a terrible mistake 10 years ago when they tried to sell it off for condos for development. Because, we live in the Sun Belt. Nashville is one of the largest growing cities in the country. And the city really just saw this beautiful piece of land right next to downtown that was public park space that was really being underutilized. And they wanted to sell it off. And it caused such an uproar. But I think after that uproar, that's when I joined in the research. I just thought like, oh my goodness, what's happening? And I joined in the fight. I went to the Parks Board meeting. I went to the city council meetings. I made the case that this park cannot be sold. And that's where I met all the descendants who were there dressed in their Civil War uniforms and in the Abraham Lincoln costume and in the Civil War dresses. And all of these people are like, wow, like your anger could be so productive. Let's talk. And we realized that the reason why the city thought it could sell this is because we hadn't done enough with the people of the site, right? And that's because history has largely silenced stories of enslavement and has largely silenced Black people who want to talk about stories of enslavement. And so we wanted to change that by making it a story that was so much more than enslavement. Of course, it starts with enslavement and it comes out of the legacy of enslavement. But rather than going to a site where you are telling Black people that their history is in slavery, it's not, right? Like white people's history is in slavery. Like white people did the enslaving in America. So like Black people's history in America is reshaping the entire country in a massive struggle and self-reconstruction that ended up making our entire nation something different than what it was. And that is a really exciting story. That is something that I think anyone can rally around as well. It's something that we really had a lot of buy-in from, and the city now is 100% behind it. And so they've hired me and several descendants to be consultants with the landscape architects who are redesigning the park. We're working on historic panels that have the stories and the photographs of the descendants and their family members on them. So finally, the real stories can be put there, right? And so, in a lot of this, there used to be a lot of fighting, but I think in recasting the story of slavery to one that happened to everyone in the city, to one that everybody in the city sort of it's touched everyone in the city, and to one that everyone in the city needs to work through, has really made it a site for everybody and has made people more willing to buy into it. But a lot of that is like luck, circumstance, timing, and also, honestly, just the disgusting political discussions that we have in this country now, right? Because if you look at the way people are trying to cast, like what is mainstream now? I believe what I'm doing is very mainstream. Most Americans want to talk about what I'm doing. I don't think I'm doing anything radical at all, right? But some of the conversation at the federal level certainly would make it seem that I am. But I think the rest of the city doesn't see it that way at all. And so it's been really wonderful to try to think of the Civil War as an amazing fight that needed to be had, right? It was one of those wars that needed to be fought desperately. And it was a war that made us all better. And it was something that we can all sort of stand behind now as we decide who are we as a country, right? Like Nashville's deciding who is it as a city, and Tennessee is deciding what is it as a state, and the US is deciding who are we all. And this is a particularly exciting and important time to have those conversations and to make those decisions.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, really interesting. That kind of because I kind of was just expecting this sort of pushback that these are things that we shouldn't be talking about from certain groups, and no, but it is kind of like great to hear that it is kind of something that people have rallied around, and there are ways of speaking about it that aren't kind of this culture war and yeah, this difficult ground to be covering. Yeah, I'm happy to open it up.
I just wanted to say one additional thing I should have said earlier, and that is the only reason this works is because this is what's already been on the ground for a long time, right? Like I'm not coming in and like making it this. I'm picking up on strands of things that already existed and trying to tie them together and facilitate conversations between people who have expressed these thoughts to me separately, right? And in doing a lot of the genealogical work, working with the African American Historical and Genealogical Society here in Nashville to help make sure that the database I created was one that would be useful for descendants, that they could find their ancestors there, right? And then working with the landscape architects, working with descendants of both Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers, Black and white, right? There's so much overlap in the discussions that are being had. And people are always so shocked when I tell them what's going on in Nashville because, the head of our fundraising committee is Kix Brooks. He's a white country music star, right? He believes that the full story is the story that needs to be told because it's more interesting that way. Civil War tourism is slowly sort of dying off in Tennessee. And the reason why is because we've only told half the story and we've really alienated a lot of people who are also part of it and who have a right to claim that part of the story. So it's a correction that's been long overdue, and a correction that we have a ton of support for. So it's really lovely just to be allowed to kind of be in that milieu and work with that understanding.
I think Angela brings up a really good kind of case study of changes that are happening in real time. And she has that kind of on the ground experience that really kind of can speak to these conversations that are happening. And I think that's quite rare when you talk about museums and the kind of dichotomy because you can't often see that evolution and all those conversations that go on in the background. You just kind of see the changes in narrative. Sometimes they're quite drastic, sometimes they're less so. And it's difficult to kind of ascertain exactly where those conversations came from and who partook in them. Through the National Museums Liverpool, the community, the wider Liverpool community of researchers, both within and outside the, if you want to call them the ivory towers of the higher education network, have been extremely active in conversations and had kind of put forth ideas of what different topics should be talked about and how it speaks to not only a Liverpool history, but a national and international history as well. When we talk about sites that are really pushing the envelope, though, the immediate example that comes to mind is actually an American plantation. And like Angela says, a lot of American plantations, like the hoop skirts and the mint juleps and the imagine you were here on a sunny day in July or whatever. But I believe it was 2014, Whitney Plantation opened in Louisiana. And that was a drastic cut. In the kind of divide of what it is to be a plantation museum, because instead of going into the house and wearing fancy clothes and talking about all the luxuries of the time, they went outside and talked about what a plantation is actually, which is kind of an agribusiness. It's not just a fancy house with beautiful clothes and lots of food. And so that was a really interesting example of how a site could really separate and distinguish itself within a sea of what Angela described earlier. And I think it was a really brave call, and it was not something that was done in a bubble. I do think finances had a lot to do with it because unlike a lot of other plantations who are maybe National Trust for Historic Preservation or have to get government financing, it was singularly financed for a very, very long time. So they had that freedom to kind of say, hey, we want to be different. We want to do this our own way. And of course, that's evolved over time. But that kind of immediate focus and initial goal of separating and having these honest conversations and it's been an interesting case study to look at over the years because it remains really prominent and popular throughout the kind of plantation history, which I think may have been a surprise for a lot of the individuals that go to plantations a lot and want that romantic telling, is how this one that really does separate so drastically became such a force within this conversation. So I it's an it, there's so many interesting case studies when you look at something like this, and I think it'll be an interesting conversation as we develop, and as I said, the museum's developing as well. So stay tuned. We'll circle back in the next few years to talk about it a bit more.
I guess I was thinking about this from, I guess, again, from the, I guess, in terms of kind of carceral legacies and the way that you have, you have places like, obviously, the Angola rodeo and things, which of course, are very, very problematic. And I was sort of thinking about this, something I've noticed recently, more from an intellectual academic perspective, is if you read kind of scholarship and research on prison tourism, heritage tourism, which sometimes talks also about kind of, I guess, dungeons and things used for enslaved people, but talks about kind of, I guess, decommissioned prisons as the primary space. His sort of, I suppose, even 10 years ago, the people writing about them, it was very kind of, the criticism was very like, isn't this bad? Look at these terrible tourists going there, and but in a way that wasn't really pushing an alternative, and was kind of, I guess also kind of exploiting that, exploiting the problems of that to kind of publish research. So really kind of, I guess, reproducing the spectatorship that Michelle Brown criticizes. What I think is interesting is that actually Michelle Brown posed a question actually, in something she wrote about what would a museum of prison abolition look like. So not what would a prison museum look like, and it's a really interesting provocation, and one that I have kind of discussed at the National Justice Museum, which again is, it's a kind of state institution, and how do these, spaces, which often still got links with the Ministry of Justice or whoever, how do they start to bring that in? But what I've noticed is, in both, I guess, the kind of Anglo-American context, but also as well in the French context, they're starting to say, well, how can this heritage be used to push a kind of critique of incarceration, to, rather than it just condemning these sites and saying, you know, this is sensationalist, this endorses kind of incarceration, it plays into racist logics, all of these things. And I think that's interesting. And I think that possibly some of the work done in museums and heritage sites linked to transatlantic slave trade has kind of paved the way for that, because as soon as you start to think of those connections and you start to say, well, actually, this is two very different groups of people, but actually the legacies are there, and the criminal justice system in both the UK and the US and elsewhere is built on racist logics, and we need to openly address these things. Suddenly, different possibilities open up, but it is very slow, I think.
Um, yeah, what you say about critique of incarceration and then this kind of gone with the wind style of presenting American plantations. I think that those are both go hand in hand as I see it in my research and the work of researchers around me, where in the ways that you talk about critiquing incarceration and what it would look like to have a museum of prison abolition. And I think in it we could imagine the same treatment of American plantations where we know the plantation economic model is still being used and still being applied. And if we take a really close look at the letters between enslavers or take a look at their financial books, we see that even, a single plantation is maybe an inaccurate way where a lot of the enslaved families in Georgia, they were collections of related plantations, where there were management structures, and in that way, you're dealing with a true industrialized conglomerate, and enslaved people play a complex role within that as quote unquote field hands, but also managers themselves in that enslavement system and couriers between plantations. Um, yeah, the critique of incarceration, critique of agribusiness and plantation economies, and realizing that the economic model that started with plantations and chattel slavery is just renewed every 20 years, every 40 years, and to use an American plantation as a starting point for that critique and that conversation. Um, I mean, it's kind of um, a hope and a dream to kind of see that conversation. I know it would be very difficult to get there, but it is possible. I mean, it certainly. warranted.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's kind of brought us nicely onto the final question, which I mean, a lot of you've already touched upon, but that's to do with impact. Whether you're able to kind of talk about personal accounts of where your own research has kind of you've noticeably impacted public perceptions of the transatlantic slave trade. Kind of if you've got any sort of individual case studies, sorry, where you can, you've had this feedback. And then in turn, kind of, do you find that there's a divide between the academic and professional audiences to the visiting public to museums? Um, or are they kind of, do they sort of develop in tandem with one another? I mean, as I say, we've kind of covered parts of this, but if there's anything you kind of thought was a really interesting example of impact, yeah, it'd be great to hear.
I'll be extremely brief because I just kind of want to throw this out to the audience. But one thing I found really recently is the impact of pop culture on specifically historic houses. We talk about plantations and historic houses. I've not heard the word Bridgerton more often than I have the past few years when talking about romanticism and nostalgia, looking at historic houses. And honestly, it's come up obviously quite predominantly in the UK, but even when talking about kind of these entities in the US and the impact that has had both negatively and positively on the kind of understanding of what this regent and regality and luxurious lifestyle was in fiction and reality has been a really interesting development, I would say, especially looking at a post kind of 2020 world and where conversations have come to both in the US and the UK. So I saw that question. I was like, I have to bring up Bridgerton just because it plagues me to my core. No offense to Bridgerton. If anybody online is a Bridgerton fan, I do apologize. All the respect, but I hear it a lot, and I have it's an interesting rationalization and an interesting lens to look at these houses through, obviously being quite fictional, but still having a massive impact in how they're consumed in person and how people place themselves within this history, even though knowing what they've been exposed to is fiction. It's an interesting phenomenon that I wanted to throw out to the group, but please feel free to pick up or not.
I actually, it's not really about any impact I have had, but a couple of years ago, I visited the Jane Austen house in, how I want to say Hampshire. Apologies if it's not there. Um, and that's interesting because there is this um, small cabinet dedicated to the role of certain characters and possibly Jane Austen's family members, I can't remember, in the transatlantic slave trade. And there's this one bit I think in Northanger Abbey, so where somebody makes some money in the colonies, and it's not very explicit, but there's also this kind of, so you have this kind of interesting cabinet where you have some books, including Edward Said's Orientalism, um, and maybe race and culture. I can't remember. But it's interesting because somebody has said we need to decolonize the Jane Austen house, and they put a cabinet, and you can imagine some academics going, "Yay, we've done it!" And possibly other people didn't really notice it. Possibly my mother didn't notice it, but I was like, "Oh, I can see that they wanted to do something, but they didn't know what." And again, I imagine there's more interest in Jane Austen as well since Bridgerton. It's a return of the stately home and so on. Um, so yeah, so it's not really about how I've changed things. I suppose I found that actually working with contemporary art galleries can be a better space for doing things. And what I found when I lived in Nottingham was with the Contemporary Gallery, which is just down the road from the Natural Justice Museum, it was quite a good space for things like reading groups where you actually could bring together academics, non-academics, and actually push some of kind of these questions. Um, so I suppose that's where I felt it's easier to bring those two groups of people together and have kind of quite deep conversations.
Yeah, I'd just jump in if that's kind of what you've talked about there, that kind of to add on to the question, that kind of, is it a case maybe of museums seeing trends outside of the academic field and latching onto them? Not that sounds quite a negative, like latching on, but sort of riding those waves and kind of saying we can exploit this kind of current public obsession with certain shows, things like that, to sort of get, capitalize your own sort of takes on a topic, whether that's kind of a worthwhile strategy, especially in terms of when funding is a thing, relying on visitors to kind of cater to what they kind of are already interested in.
I don't think it's that mercenary, right? Like, I think really what it comes down to, at least this is just perspective. Again, I haven't done big studies on this. I will because I'm very interested in digging deeper. But I think that, academia is one very specific system of knowledge, right? And if you are trained as an academic, you think a certain way. And we all know that academia started because countries like Great Britain wanted to find ways to send people out into the world and know more about who was being colonized, right? So it's already a deeply colonial institution. And so the way that we are trained to think has some benefits, of course. I'm grateful that my brain does what it does now, that I've gone through all of the education that I've had in my life and all of the wonderful conversations I've been shaped by. However, speaking with descendants of the Fort Negley site, I realize that they are steeped in a completely different system of knowledge that is in no way inferior to the one that I was raised with, right? And it's one that comes from oral traditions, one that comes from like understanding of community and how communities shape people. It's one that comes from an understanding of resilience and having to survive in ways and in places that are quite hostile to your existence. And these systems of knowledge that I have sort of just glimpsed, I'm not fluent in them, but that I'm glimpsing as I'm interviewing descendants, as I'm putting this history out there with them, as we're sort of on panels together, talking at the State Museum or at, wherever we've been invited to talk, I'm really coming to learn that like museums are in a position to capitalize on systems of knowledge outside of academia. And that's so important. And that is something that they absolutely should do, right? Like the things that the descendants know, the things that genealogists know, these are ways that I was just not trained to think. And the way I was trained to think just fails me when it comes to working with Fort Negley. I just don't have all the tools. And fortunately, all of my collaborators, the local people who work there, they do have those tools. And so it's been really wonderful to sort of be able to learn and then to also share the ones that I have because some of mine are useful for them and vice versa, right? So it's a really nice collaboration. But I did want to pick up the Bridgerton football because I have to. Um, and all that to say that I do think as a work of fiction, it's very important that Bridgerton exists, right? Like I'm not here to critique Shonda Rhimes, not doing that. But I will say like it's really important and beautiful and nice that we can all envision what a colorblind past would have looked like because that helps us to imagine what a future could look like in which we've transcended, right? We will never transcend our racial issues. We will never, that's never going to happen, right? That you've already opened that box. It's not going to go back in. But like, I do feel like Bridgerton is almost like the little dove at the bottom of the box where we sort of see that like there's a possibility to reimagine ourselves and who we want to be. However, I think the temptation when people think of Bridgerton and then go to these beautiful estate houses where the money all came from the blood and sweat of enslaved Africans who had no choice in the matter and who were never compensated and whose descendants still suffer today because of what happened, right? That is the problem, right? Like, and that's the problem that I think we all sort of face when we work with these sites because even at Fort Negley, the temptation is to make it into this triumphant place. It's a place where freedom, it's the birthplace of freedom. It's the place where Black people stood up to their oppressors. It's the place where we decided we wanted to be a different country. That's all well and good, but let's remember, like there was an oppressor, there was an oppressive system in place, and that system still exists now. That's the other legacy. The legacies of slavery are not just all the people who survived it; it's also all the people who made it happen, and all of their descendants, and all of the riches that came from that. And I think Bridgerton sort of allows us to separate out the oppressing forces and just kind of look at the color blindness of a situation, and that we need to step away from that temptation, even though that temptation is really strong because it allows us to smooth over the differences and sort of have more pleasant and easy conversations. But sometimes you just have to argue a little bit. You got to fight because some of these things have to be said, even if they are deeply uncomfortable.
I was also going to say briefly, in terms of public attention, and how that might match up with researchers and academics in the field. I mean, Mary brought up 2007 as being a year of focus. I'll be interested to watch after 2026 and in the years to come. There's a lot of focus right now, political, social attention on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. And there's a lot of money, interestingly, maybe pouring into institutions. I mean, pouring in, that may be exaggerating. There's a lot of grant funding to celebrate the 250th anniversary, and I'll be interested to see heritage institutions take that money, apply that money, how the viewing public is brought into that, but then really importantly, what are the consequences? What's the research consequences of that in the next year, 5 years? And of course, um, museum visitors, users of public libraries, the consequences and effects to that viewing public from that. It's just, I mean, how do we celebrate the 250th anniversary? You could pivot that. How do we commemorate it in a different kind of more complexly researched way? I think is a question that institutions are going to have to figure out for themselves. But anyway, I feel like it will be another focus year, similar to 2007, similar to community transcription efforts in 2010 around then.
Can I share one, Will, that I think you might really enjoy? So the John Carter Brown Library is doing this huge exhibit based on things in its collections. And their idea is that they have chosen, I think, 50 pieces in their collections from that same year, from 1776, right? And they have farmed it out to 50 different scholars whose specialties are to do with those documents. And we are each writing up like an exhibit sort of text and also a piece that goes into an anthology about that piece and how it sort of reflects to the state of the world at this time. And so even though it is like, oh, we're celebrating America, da da da, but really it's like this is what the world was like when America was doing its thing. And so of course we touch on the Age of Revolutions, we touch on slave revolts. I wrote a piece on the Dutch Surinamese revolt, right? And the Maroons who were working there to gain independence and how that is sort of spread and reverberated across the Caribbean. So it's really fantastic to sort of look at the hemisphere at this time and look at the world at this time and see that America was sort of like one little pin in these larger processes. And I think that's the perfect way to look at our country, right? Like we're not the center of the world. We're a periphery. We're one little pin in these global processes.
Well, that's great. I mean, yeah, again, I love the idea that the current U.S. administration has opened up a lot of funding, and the results of this funding, as you were just describing, can be a lot bigger and better and more helpful than maybe what they were um, imagining. Be interesting to see.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a good place where we can sort of bring this to a close now. As thanks to all the panelists, that was really fascinating discussion and a lot of food for thought, really, for my own work and hopefully for yourselves and obviously our audience. So yeah, thank you very much. If you keep an eye on the CSIS website, but for the upcoming seminar series and other events that are going to be hosted in a similar vein. Thanks very much.